Hello, welcome to the Omnivorous Bookworm. My name is Lauren, and in today's video, I wanted to do 5 tips that I think will help more people enjoy reading classic books. So, most of these tips will work for older classics. That's what I'm thinking about, not more contemporary classics. Some of my tips are more obvious than others, but these are things that I use that I feel like have helped me. I've always enjoyed reading classics, but they've helped me to enjoy them even more so. So hopefully some of them will help you as well. If you have any additional tips, please let me know. I'm always interested to try new things, and please like and subscribe because I'm a new channel and every subscriber is very much appreciated. So my first tip is to do research. I'm not talking about like reading lots of papers. I'm talking about like Wikipedia research. Like just do something, the minimum. If it's a new author that you're not familiar with, find out about them. What are some themes that they usually like to write about? If it's from a country, especially like if you're going to read a Russian classic book, it's really helpful to know what that country's history was. Well, any country. If you're going to read an American classic, knowing, for example, it was written pre-Civil War versus after the Civil, like all of those things can really help you to pinpoint sort of what kind of happening around this book when it was published. I even like to, for some books, to actually read a plot synopsis before I even get into the book, if it's not a plot-centered book, if it's more a character-centered book, because personally I find that I don't get as frustrated with the book. I'm more able to actually enjoy the words because I'm not wondering what's going to happen. Obviously that can depend on the book and it depends on you as a reader, but I definitely would go in, do a quick Google search, look at the book and see if maybe it's not the best classic for you, once you do that research, but you kind of know a little bit before going in. I feel like it's helpful. My number 2 tip is to make a character list. Again, this is something you can usually find online. It's not something you have to make yourself, but it can be really helpful to have a character list handy next to you while you're reading the book, especially if it has a large cast of characters. And also because in a lot of classic literature, you will have people called by multiple names. So they will have their first name, their Christian name, their given name, as well as being called Mr. or Miss or Mrs. So-and-so. And that can get pretty confusing, especially if you have a family with like a bunch of unmarried daughters and they're all like Miss Elliot, for example, because I'm reading Persuasion. That's the first one that came to mind. It's like, oh, which Miss Elliot, or who are they? Also, a lot of classics, people can tend to have more like common names like John, Anne, Elizabeth, Sarah. And personally, I find that, when you have a lot of those more like classically common names, I actually can find it a little bit more confusing who we're talking about because I'm like, John, it's like, I don't know, it's harder for me sometimes. Number 3 is to keep in mind pacing and vocabulary differences. I feel like this is pretty self-explanatory, or it can be pretty obvious, but it's also something that we can easily forget. So we are used to sort of the modern pacing expectations of literature, which is going to be much faster. We have a very specific, the third act is the rising action, and then we're going to have, not all classic literature is going to follow that, and the pacing generally is going to be much slower. Conversations, people are going to have different, ways that they are communicating in their conversations. They're not going to be communicating as directly as we would communicate today. And also keep in mind, language is always evolving, and so just like we have slang today, people back then would have had slang. They would have different ways of speaking about things. 2 really quick, simple examples that I feel like most people will know is, for example, if you see in a book, Mr. So-and-so was making love to Miss So-and-so in the drawing room. If you're a modern reader, you're going to get a very different impression of what is happening in the drawing room than if you understand what that phrase actually means, in the 19th century or whenever the book was written. Another simple one is, if they were having a gay time, I'm like most of us know that, gay, what we know of as gay today is not what people would have thought of as gay, 100 years ago or 200 years ago. But it's also important to know that just because they might not have spoken about certain, for example, when they say making love, they might allude to what we would think of that as today. They wouldn't use those words, but they're not going to speak about those things directly. They're going to be very indirect if they're speaking about things that we would just come out and say. And so understanding that and having proper expectations for how people would have talked about sensitive subjects or what they would have viewed as sensitive subjects is really helpful, so that things aren't just flying over your head constantly, especially if English isn't your first language. Um, Obviously, classics are going to be more of a challenge because they're using a vocabulary and a way of speaking that English speakers today, no matter what type of English they're speaking or what country of origin they're from, are not speaking like that. So it can be helpful to look up any of those phrases, or to just realize that you know that's going to be happening. Number 4, I would say it's important to realize, like, being a classic is not a genre. That is just a word that we use to describe something that was written at a certain time. But when it was published, it was not a classic. It would have fit into a genre, even if it wouldn't have been the same way that we would describe genres today. For example, Jane Austen's works would have been considered romances, although they're very different than the types of romances that we have today. We have the Gothic genre. You might have an adventure, like the Three Musketeers would be an adventure book. You might have books that would be more literary, like Moby Dick, and those types of books. That it's important to keep in mind that that was in a genre at that time, and they would have been perceived differently at that time. So was this a commercial fiction book when it was published? Was this a literary book when it was published? How was it received? And that can kind of go into the research part of it, but I just feel like that's an important thing to keep in mind, especially when you look at the plot and the pacing and sort of how things were done. For example, I read Lady Audley's Secret, and there's a lot of very shocking plot twists, and it was a very commercially uh, successful book at that time, very popular. And so if you keep that in your mind, it can be more helpful for your enjoyment to realize, like, oh, this is what people would have found shocking. This is why this was included. It was because this was a commercial fiction, versus if they're trying to make a larger point or was more intended to be a more literary book. I feel like a lot of times when we see the word classic, we always attach literary to it, and sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's not true. Like, it could be a mystery, it could be something else entirely. And my last tip, and I feel like this has helped me a lot, is to experiment with different formats for reading classics. So if you always read your books physically, and you want to have an actual book, if you're struggling with a classic, I would really recommend trying audio. Even if you don't use it for the whole book, it can be really, really helpful, especially once you're sort of into the ways that people speak. It can take some of your bandwidth to actually concentrate on it. At least it does for me. Also, even just thinking about the type of physical book that you have, if the print is really small, if you do have like an older copy, it can be just helpful to keep in mind that if the book is out of copyright, you can get the ebook for free and make the print a little bit bigger, if that is helpful to you. I know for me it's helpful because I don't see well, but we do have research that shows that everybody actually reads faster and reads better when not based on the fonts, but actually based on the typeface, so how big the font is. So especially if English isn't your first language, or if you're struggling with it for some reason, it can be one of those things that can make a big difference, but you don't think about it because you're just struggling with the actual book in front of you, and you think, oh, if I actually read this as an ebook and made the font a little bit bigger, it would be easier for me. Or if I listened to the audiobook, it would have been easier for me. And LibriVox has a lot of free audio books for anything that's out of copyright, so it has a lot of classics. Sometimes they're hit and miss, sometimes they're better than others, but it's a nice thing to keep in mind if it's something that you're looking for, even if it's just for a part of the book and not the whole book. Also, classics tend to be a little bit longer, so I feel like reading the audiobook helps to kind of break it up, and you're not taking weeks and weeks and weeks to read a book. So those are my 5 tips for reading classics. Let me know down below if you have any other suggestions or anything that you have found helpful that helps you to enjoy the classics that you're reading more. So thank you for watching, and please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.